I'm going to be talking about video games, and I'm going to be talking about how video games currently occupy this potentially very interesting but also very awkward space culturally in terms of its ability to address serious topics, what you might consider the kind of topics that documentaries would address typically. And it's not that it doesn't happen, it does happen, but there's a long history of like how we've gotten to the particular way it happens in games now. And even though it's gotten a lot better than it has been, there's a lot of room for improvement. And I think some ways that it is currently limited are not that well understood and not articulated very well. So that's what I'm going to do here today. So yeah, this is the first time I'm kind of grappling with, not the first time thinking about a lot of this stuff, but the first time trying to articulate it in a presentation. So this is going to be kind of a trial run for a lot of this stuff. But this is a very nice, warm group. This feels like Thanksgiving, right? Oh yeah, no, good joke. I mean, I would have made that joke, so it couldn't resist. Okay, so this is, I call this video games in no man's land because there's this space in between two poles that games occupy that I'm going to talk about how difficult it is to occupy this space. But just a little bit about me and the kind of entities that and past projects that me and my partner Clara have been involved in. So as William mentioned, I'm a CMS alum. When I was here, I worked on video games, but I don't come from the world of computer science and engineering. I come from the world of film theory, film studies. I did film as an undergraduate, so I've never been, at least from my perspective, in a kind of like tech world. That's not the vector I come to games from. And me and Clara are mainly interested in games in terms of storytelling, how they express drama, conflict, all this kind of stuff. We actually have a few different entities we founded. The one I have here is called Empathy Box. That's our studio. And we also have a consultancy, what we call narrative design consultancy company called Fiction Control, because fiction is out of control. So, we also have, obviously, like both of us worked at MIT. Not only did we go to school here, but both of us worked for many years at the Gambit Game Lab when it was the Singapore MIT Gambit Game Lab. And we did a bunch of experimental projects there in narrative, also addressing some serious topics, which I will talk about. And now we both, Clara's the full-time professor at NYU. And so she does game studies, narrative design there, just worked on a project that was like a VR Alice in Wonderland project that was shown at Future Storytelling. And they're kind of in talks to discuss whether that is going to go to Sundance, perhaps. And I also teach immersive narrative, interactive narrative there. And I also have worked at Harmonix Music Systems, which is a local Boston-based company that did Rock Band, Guitar Hero, Dance Central. Eran Argosy, their co-founder, now works in the music department at MIT. So Clara and I were in the kind of Boston game scene in a pretty heavy way from about 2007 to 2013, which was the time that we were here, not as students, but as...
When Boston still had a game scene.
Yeah, well, it has a game scene, but there was definitely this everybody says this, the golden age is when I was there, right? That's what everybody thinks. But in this case, we think it's true. But there was definitely this flare up at that time in terms of sort of like there were big game companies that were making games, there were a lot of indie companies that were making games, and a lot of these people not all of them have left, but there's definitely been a kind of many of the people who were here at that time have actually left. So anyway, including us. So this is a bit of a background about us. And so I want to open with talking about this in-between space I keep mentioning. So this is a picture of game designer Hideo Kojima, who, depending on who you ask, is either a great game designer or a terrible game designer. He's a kind of controversial figure. I'm trying to think of like a film cultural equivalent, and there's many different ways to think about it, but like a good shorthand might be like James Cameron. Like people think he's a good storyteller, but there's the kind of like a weird ego thing going on with him that like also makes him very controversial. And he kind of has addressed serious topics, but also does it kind of through genre, and his games make a huge amount of money. And anyway, Tribeca Film Festival sort of invited him to come give a talk. And so the point here is that these mechanisms that we have in the kind of like film community for finding kind of new, edgy, interesting content in the digital space, or what used to be kind of like finding, what's the interesting, small film that everybody needs to see, like what's the interesting documentary that everybody needs to see. They're now looking to find the equivalents of these in the digital space. So, and this is something that's kind of happening all over the place, like all the kind of like classic film festivals have their like digital track or their like immersive track, or Sundance has this thing called Sundance New Frontier, and it's both a kind of a showcase and it's also a workshop. You can go to kind of a storytelling workshop for a kind of immersive interactive media there. And what's interesting to me though is, by and large, and I don't want to overstate this, but this is it's something that tends to focus on what I would call the kind of like I would say kind of extreme of like nonprofit kind of documentary serious content, as opposed to stuff that is a little bit more, again, this in-between space, right? Where it's like, it's not just something you would see at a festival, it's like a movie that's like intended to make money. I guess I would say like, something that's not made for profit versus a documentary like An Inconvenient Truth, or something, a movie like Spotlight, right? Which was like an Oscar movie. You could go see that at the same movie theater that was showing the Avengers movie. These were like part of the same universe, but you understood that these were like the same medium, and that you might see an action movie, but then you also might see this Spotlight movie. So there was a talk in New York recently where people from the Tribeca Institute, which finds kind of interactive projects, came and gave a talk, and they're very explicitly focused just kind of on this nonprofit space, and which is fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with being focused on that space, but it does kind of raise the question of, if your kind of organization is going to honor somebody who is kind of functioning in a kind of like commercial space that is addressing serious topics the way that we're used to in other media, like the way that Christopher Nolan can release a movie like Dunkirk, which is, I guess, at least ostensibly seen as like a serious movie about war. There's very little being done to actually find and cultivate a similar kind of like, it's commercial but it's also serious in the kind of space of interactive. It tends to be either kind of like super like only entertainment, kind of like borderline pornographic, or it tends to be like way in the opposite direction, almost as a way to kind of say, almost as a way to kind of like prove that they're not like those horrible video games that you've heard of. There's very much an attempt to kind of eliminate all ambiguity that something could ever be taken as something that was like entertainment, and that it might be confused with something like Grand Theft Auto or Call of Duty or these other kinds of games. So there's a polarization that has kind of happened, and I'm going to talk a bit about that. This is just to give you an impression. The reason I care about this, is it always showing the ask questions thing? Can I get rid of this? Off, okay. So one of the reasons I care about this is because I've been interested in storytelling in games for a long time, and this, from my perspective, doesn't necessarily manifest as being interested in sort of like political topics or quote-unquote serious topics. But I feel like the more interested you are in story and representation in games, the more you inevitably encounter this. So in a way, people who are interested in just the concept of representation in digital media, who are interested in LGBT rights, kind of talking about racism in the context of interactive media, they're essentially interested in the same thing that people who are interested in storytelling in games are interested in, because you are interested in the content of the representation itself, which in the context of the culture and the industry surrounding games has often been downplayed. One of the reasons I stress that I don't come from computer science is because there is an ideology of kind of like engineering and computer science in the kind that has set the tone in the world of video games that very much, again, it's not, I don't want to overstate it because it's not across the board, but it's a pattern you can see where people tend to deny the meaning of any kind of representation, right? It's like, oh, it's just a game, or it doesn't really matter, what the character looks like. The gameplay is what's important, how fun it is, how good the rule systems are. There's a kind of attempt to, from a kind of engineering perspective, assert formal qualities of the game over any other kind of meaning. And of course this has, and it's usually by white men who do that, and it's had like, one of the things that's happening in the game space now is other kinds of diverse groups are coming out and saying, no, that's bullshit. All these things really matter. And when you say everything matters, the graphics matter, the sound matters just as much as the rules, whether you're coming at it from the perspective of being an activist or just somebody who is interested in storytelling, you're essentially talking about the same thing. You're saying what you represent matters to the experience. And this has long been something that has been denied in the kind of like common rhetoric in the kind of commercial world of games. So my point is to say that I've always been interested in storytelling, but this is, in a way, you have to work very hard as somebody who has an interest in storytelling in games to not be interested in kind of, for lack of a better term, activism. I mean, you're going to be interested in, what generates conflict and how this relates to kind of like real world contexts as you try to create games that, have stories that you care about. So like I worked on this game, Colonial Williamsburg Revolution, which was a history game about the American Revolution. 1 year at the Gambit Game Lab, the students made this kind of joking satire of like a police state that has outlawed gum. So the game is about like chewing gum and then overthrowing the government by blowing gum on it, and then you take over the government. So that's what you're seeing there. You're seeing a girl who's like blowing her bubble, and then the other girl's like, yes, blow the bubble, And then the rent-a-cop is like looking the other way. But if he sees you, he'll beat you up. So this is actually also like a police brutality game. Anyway, this is something that the Singaporean students chose when they were making this project. But for me, the research goal when I was working here when I was working well, at least at the Gambit Lab, it was like, how do you model revolution in a kind of simple game system? So, and then eventually this led to the Snowfield, which was, and I'll get into this later, started as a storytelling experiment. A game, the research question was entirely about storytelling. It had nothing to do with like war or like presenting war in a kind of depressing, horrible way. But we ended up making this game about the First World War that made people want to kill themselves, which was great. It was just awful and terrible and presented the war in all of its just nastiness and really made people upset, which was what a game about really any war, but especially that war, really should be doing. So I want to get a little bit into, fighting this whole idea of like, why have video games had such a historical tension between the idea of let me rephrase that. Like, how do you, why do games have a kind of contentious historical relationship with like serious topics, right? Like a lot of it has to do with this idea that games, to some degree, in a larger cultural sense, are used as shorthand for like frivolity, right? Like you'll say like, it's not serious, it's just a game. It's games by and large, culturally and historically, are associated with something that is like removing seriousness or like removing meaning from them, or somehow escaping meaning, or somehow evading consequence. This is not the only meaning that the word game can have, but to some degree, this is what you're fighting when this is the larger cultural perception, and even people who work in games that address serious topics, even subconsciously have embodied this. So I don't want to say that it's even an easy thing to fight a lot of the time. It's just a very deep, subtly, insidiously ingrained thing that we have to always be aware of. It has a tendency to kind of like already position something as automatically not a serious cultural object. I had a conversation with somebody recently at the Future Storytelling event in New York where they were telling me the story that there was a grant project and it was about immigration. And they had designed a game that was about trying to get immigrants across the border without them being killed. And I didn't play this game. Like, I don't know anything about this game, so the criticism that this person had may have been accurate depending on the execution of the proposal. So perhaps it was kind of bad and done in bad taste. But I thought it was interesting in this conversation how the person I was talking to was kind of like saying, you can't make a game about that, right? You can't address this topic in an interactive context because making it interactive at all is trivializing it, which is the main thing I disagree with, right? It's how you do it. And but there's a lot of people who think that just by introducing interaction, you are just automatically trivializing something.
Sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
What is your definition of a game?
Well, I mean, so this is a hard thing to... So, coming from CMS, I define everything in cultural context. So I'm not into like a formal definition of like, this is technically a game or that's not technically a game. There is a cultural conversation about what is a game, and that conversation is what we need to understand how this meaning breaks down, right? So there are people in the world of video games who are, going back to the formalist thing, they have like formal definitions of what a game is. They'll say it's something with rules, it's something with goals. You know, one formal definition says if it's rules with goals, it's a game. If it's rules without goals, it's just play. Now, you don't have to buy that, right? I mean, that you can be more complicated than that. For my purpose, when I say game, I mean cultural objects that have been culturally constructed as games in the context of the rise of video game culture in the last 35 years and appear on video game distribution channels and in conversations about video games. I mean, for me, when I say game, that's what I mean. I don't, like, for me, if somebody thinks it's a game, then it's a game. Because they're going back to the idea of like formalists, this kind of like formal fight to kind of like say these are, there's a fight to exclude certain kinds of content as not being important, right? So like one of the ways people do that is there are games that don't involve shooting, and some people say those are not games, you know, so. Because games are things where you shoot people, right? Like so, or games are things where you have, and there's various versions of this. That's the kind of like stupidest version of it. But then there's kind of like the intellectual, like supposedly enlightened version of it that's still a variation of the same thing, which is like, well, this has rules but not a goal, so technically, you know, and you know, so your culture doesn't matter because of look at my graph, you know, I did a study. Here's my PhD. You don't matter, right? So you know, that can happen, right? You know, so I don't want to. It's not an. I want to say that it happens. It's the same thing happening whether it's intellectualized or not. So from my point of view, it's very important for us to understand that it's a contested cultural artifact, and there's a lot of like cultural fighting going on right now about who gets to claim this culture, because the culture has. I don't want to say it's always been occupied by, because it hasn't. It's been more diverse than just like straight white dudes. But it is having the surge now of like more diverse groups who are like there's a huge like trans gaming movement in creating video games. And there's a lot of people who are kind of coming and saying like, hey, you know, we have played games our whole lives. You know, games are for us too. And so one of the responses to this has been kind of like, oh, well, those aren't games. The games you like aren't games. The games you're making aren't games because they don't blah, 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 you know, and the blah, blah, blah is bullshit, right? So the important thing is that this is a culture that people are a part of, right? And however you define game is valid, at least from my point of view. So also, incidentally speaking, this talk is not about this, but if you want to like go down to like seriously weird, scary rabbit hole stuff about this, how many people know about Gamergate? Gamergate. Yeah, it's the preview of the Trump election, right? I mean, it's basically like the testing. It was like the test for like the alt-right in terms of like how it functioned as a kind of like online phenomena and the way. Anyway, so it's this is like deeply horrible, weird stuff. And but this talk is only peripherally about that. So the point here is that you know games are a contested term. Games, even though there is a movement now to make them serious, that movement in some ways is a kind of like, is a response to this. It's a response to this kind of like cultural norm. You know, so, and this is just, I guess, reinforce my point, right? Like games are typically seen as like either one of these two things, right? It's like silly, has nothing to do with anything. It's just like empty signifiers, although technically it's not because Mario's Italian, which is weird. But in this like Smurf world. How did he get there? Like, does he? Anyway, yes. Well, there's that too. And then you have like Grand Theft Auto, which is like you know kind of like I mean, the people who make that game talk about what they do as if they were Dave Simon. They're not Dave Simon. It's not The Wire. It's very much like you know they kind of address serious topics sometimes, but more as like a cover story I mean, like kind of like what, actually very much like the Louis C.K. allegations right now, right? Where it's kind of like presenting sort of like ironic understanding of something as a way to kind of cover up actually doing the thing for real. So like that's what I think is going on in a lot of the GTA games. So like I would give Grand Theft Auto as an example of something that is actually not effectively addressing serious topics, even though they sort of have that reputation. And that would be my reasoning. So, but this is the tendency of how we tend to see games, right? They're either kind of these like silly things that have no meaning, or they're kind of these like pornographic explosions of violence or whatever. And also, I think you see this kind of like understanding of games still today. Like this is a movie that I think isn't even out yet. This is the new Jumanji movie, which is actually about video games. It's about, oh, what if the Jumanji board game was a video game? And all these characters are like video game archetypes. And the humor of this film depends entirely on kind of broad cultural stereotypes of what kinds of behaviors are in games. So one of the characters is like, oh, they come back to life when they get punched in the face, ha ha ha. And it's all very like video game jokes. But it's very much based on this, again, this kind of like the frivolity of games. But my point here is that this is evidence that this is still where our broad cultural standing of games are primarily. So the response to this has been to kind of create this really sharp partition between art, activism, education, and entertainment, right? So like we want to be really sure in the world of games that we're like never mixing these things because the entertainment world of games is so strongly associated with sort of like this inability to like address serious topics in any kind of constructive way. So the serious games movement, right? What now is more called just the kind of like activism games, or it's kind of all evolving. But this kind of happened in the 2000s, and there were educational games before this, but those educational games, didn't really have a kind of like articulated movement behind them as something that was a response to kind of like commercial games, right? So the kind of so-called serious games movement was a bunch of people basically saying like, we want to make games for health, we want to make games for, I find this ironic, but military. We want to make games for civic engagement and all this kind of stuff, which is all good. I'm not saying this is bad, but it's very much a kind of like 180 degrees away response from the kind of entertainment world of games. And like for example, this is, I don't know if I think you can still play this online, September 12th. This is a game where like through its systems, it is making an argument that the more terrorists you try to kill, the more terrorists you create. So that's a good example of like a systems argument, right? A political systems argument in the game. And some people also, for a while, this was called like news gaming as well, like the idea of a political cartoon like as a game. So, but this is something that happened in this kind of a climate of the kind of mid 2000s. This is also where the term gamification, right, gets its arise from. Gamification is this idea that this is a thing that can like fix the world. So, but the idea of gamification and this whole thing where you are looking at games as kind of the opposite of kind of like socially detrimental entertainment. What we would call, or at least what I would consider that, is the reverse of the media effects argument, right? It's like an inversion of media effects. So what's the media effects argument from video games? Is anybody familiar with this? Anybody remember the 90s? Yes.
Video games will turn you into killers.
Video games will turn you into killers because we have graphs that say this is happening. And it's this basically. But there was a lot of stuff going on. There was a lot of controversy about video games, and when video games in the 90s got the graphical ability to present violence in a more realistic way, that's when a lot of the kind of controversy began to explode about it. Right, and then they talked about how the Columbine shooters had played video games, and this is something that's still brought up sometimes, but in a lot of ways, the serious games movement and the kind of like recent explosion of games that address serious topics in some ways is like a response to this idea. But the important thing is that, again, it's kind of taken one distorted pole and kind of created the inversion of it, right? And this is where the idea of gamification, and specifically the idea is that games can fix the world or can fix you. It's essentially the same kind of magic thinking with its values inverted, right? Rather than believing games can control your mind to make you bad, we believe games can control your mind to make you good. So it's essentially the same idea of like social control and like influence and I don't know, like 1984-esque kind of like, or Orwellian kind of, games have some kind of Orwellian dimension to them that affects human behavior. And of course, this is Jane McGonigal and her book, Reality is Broken. And it's not just her, but she was kind of an avatar for that kind of movement, the inversion of this whole idea. And also I want to stress that this is, this whole time when this was kind of first happening, and you had this kind of rise of like, no, games can be good. Here's a bunch of graphs. Like, no, games can be good. Look, we have all this like proof that they can change everybody. Like impact can be measured and all this kind of stuff. This is also like the rise of big data, right? Which also, and this is like the last 10, 15 years, this also of course coincides with this kind of like, draconian obsession with like testing in American schools. And you have like horrific stuff like No Child Left Behind, which is like, speaking of Orwell, like means the opposite of like what it actually does. So the idea that like, quantitative testing and all this kind of stuff is something that's going to like save everybody. And this is like the only metric by which we understand impact at all. It's like everything is quantitative, nothing is qualitative. And obviously things have to be somewhat quantitative to a degree. But there's definitely been a rise, again, with the aided by the magical thinking of this kind of like Silicon Valley generation of like, frankly, in my opinion, like hucksters, right? Who are like, our data will solve whatever problem you have. Like, look at all the data we're collecting. We can do all this stuff. And again, it's not that it's all bad. Of course, you can do good and interesting things with data collection and all this kind of stuff. But there's definitely a dark side to that, right? Which is that there's a tendency, there's a strong kind of cultural argument going on in the last 10 or so years that basically is presenting this as kind of just like a silver bullet to like any kind of problem. It's just like the data will fix it, the data will fix it, the data will fix it. And so you have this belief that even though before quantitative data had its limits, now in the new magic world of like the internet, quantitative data can replace qualitative data because it's new and there's all this stuff you don't understand about it. But I'm in Silicon Valley and we have a cool company. Check it out. Right? We all wear sandals to work. And we're changing the world. Right? It's all part of this like cultural narrative, right? That like science and technology in particular is like bringing us through this kind of like techno-utopian renaissance at the current moment. So anyway, what this has done from my point of view is it has put a lot of pressure on game makers who wish to deal with serious topics. It's put them in the position of having to drain all ambiguity and nuance from their work so they can empirically fit into like a partisan pedagogical model. It's like, so, and this is in a way, it's not that you can't make a game that's more ambiguous or kind of like, is in a kind of like, ambiguous space of like, is this art, is this entertainment, whatever. But it's very hard to find like a kind of like, there's very little kind of institutional support and understanding and articulation of that space, right? It's kind of like, if you want funding for a project that addresses serious topics, like we also need to prove that you can have impact, which means, you need, whatever your magic metric is for like figuring out all this stuff. And again, it's coming from this, this culture of like, we can know all these things now that we couldn't know before. I don't believe we can actually know them, but that's the cultural narrative backed by all this magic thinking about data. But what it has done is kind of create this world where like, if I wanted to make like the video game equivalent of like, I feel like if you were going to make, I don't know. So imagine like you were going to make a movie like Schindler's List, but like you have to have like a graph that says like this is going to produce like 69% less 69% less anti-Semitism over like 5 years, and like here's all of our stuff that we're going to use to like prove that out. This is, in a lot of ways, this is kind of like the world that we're in when it comes to like wanting to like deal with serious topics in this space. Again, I do think that for me, this again creates this question of, there's nothing wrong with doing stuff that is like way on this other pole. I want to stress this, right? I'm not critiquing that at all. But for me, it's very much, it's become like this dichotomy, right? Not like a spectrum, right? It's become this thing where like you're either making like ridiculous, violent stuff, or you're kind of making this, you're making this kind of like deeply serious kind of like not-for-profit kind of stuff. But the stuff that kind of like exists at the level of popular culture, where we mix entertainment and art and social consciousness and all this kind of stuff that exists in other media, is being kind of, people are afraid to kind of approach that middle ground in the case of games. So like stuff like this is really hard to find at the level of kind of institutional support and funding, right? Some of it actually exists, but it's all very much like made by sort of individual developers who just like are self-funding it. Anyway, I want to talk a little bit here just to give you an idea of what I mean when I talk about the different ways that stuff that exists in the world of entertainment can address serious topics. There is a BFI documentary from, I think, about 20 years ago that is Martin Scorsese just talking about his favorite films. It's like a master class kind of a thing. But one of the things he talks about in it is he goes through all his favorite filmmakers and he talks about them in terms of being storytellers, smugglers, or iconoclasts. And so, a storyteller is somebody who's dealing with, serious topics, not because they intend to, but just because that naturally arises out of being a great storyteller who is looking for conflict and human emotion. And then there are smugglers, who are people who, have a message they do want to tell, but they're like artfully concealing it for political reasons. And then an iconoclast is somebody who has a message they want to tell and they're not concealing it, right? Like they're openly defying a system. And these are not Scorsese's examples, these are my examples. For example, like Hayao Miyazaki, right, who made Nausicaa, is he presents himself as being like just a storyteller. He's like, I tell stories, I just try to find the best story. But he's like widely been positioned as somebody who is like a feminist and a kind of environmentalist, right? But he doesn't kind of show up and say, I'm a feminist and an environmentalist. But that shows in his work just because of, maybe it's his subconscious, maybe, whatever, right? But that's, an artist working, and those are the themes that come out of their work, right? So that's an example of, what we would consider a storyteller arriving at this kind of like, mature artistic kind of content, right? And then there's filmmakers like Luis Berlanga, who is the Spanish filmmaker who worked under Franco, who used to make films that were, essentially anti-fascist, but, were like coded in these ways that would like pretend like they're not. So if you've never seen The Executioner, you should definitely check it out. It's basically like an anti-fascist comedy where a guy has to, in order to win the hand of the beautiful girl, he has to make her dad happy, and her dad is an executioner for the state. And her dad, the way that he's like, well, I'll let you marry my daughter if you take over my job. So it's like a horror kids, like hijinks ensue, but it's like dark and horrible, and it says a lot about class and fascism, and it's a great movie. It actually just in the U.S. just came out on Criterion. That's the U.S. Criterion poster. And then of course, like stuff like Dr. Strangelove is like a famous kind of like what we would think of when we think of like a iconoclastic art in the case of mainstream film culture. With these examples, I just want to kind of give some examples of this in the case of video games, right? So there's two ways I want to talk about it. So in the case of games, we've got what we call AAA games, right? And then we've got the indie space. So if we were to look at games through this lens from this Scorsese BFI documentary, we have stuff like The Last of Us, which for me falls kind of on the storyteller side of it, right? Like this is not a game that really presents itself as being kind of consciously going after serious topics. It's basically Cormac McCarthy's The Road as a video game. But it's very well done, and people consider it a good story about, I don't know, friendship or parenthood or whatever. It's I wouldn't say it's like that political, but it's taken seriously as a piece of narrative art in the world of games, and it's but it doesn't have it doesn't seem to have a hidden or explicit kind of political agenda, right? And then you have stuff like BioShock, which I would argue is a kind of example of smuggling in the case of sort of like AAA games, which are like the equivalent of like Hollywood kind of games, but at that budget level, which is kind of like, hey, it's a game where you get to shoot people in this like underground water world that you slowly discover is kind of based on the teachings of Ayn Rand, right? So it sort of, I mean, I have some issues with it, but essentially it's like a critique of Ayn Rand, right? And kind of specifically kind of like techno-libertarianism. And then you have stuff like the Metal Gear Solid series, which I think some people might argue that it's more smuggling than being an iconoclast, but for me, it feels more like being an iconoclast, just because even though it's kind of presented as like it's a war story where you're a spy, it's kind of like James Bond. If you, it makes it really hits you in the face with its kind of iconoclastic gestures within the context of this genre. Like it kind of presents itself as like a James Bond story, but then you play a character who like defects from your own country and essentially becomes like Che Guevara. And there's like a whole part of the game where the game says, like remembers all the people you've killed, and then you have to like face all the ghosts of the people you've killed, right? Which is, from my perspective, feels like the kind of thing you would see in a kind of Kubrick genre film. It definitely is not pretending to be critiquing what it's critiquing. And this, incidentally, is the kind of game, this is one of the games by the Japanese game designer that we saw earlier at the beginning. This is one of Hideo Kojima's games. So in the case of the more indie game world, an example of something that is storytelling, right? Kind of like achieving this kind of like level of art, but is more in the storytelling space, would be something like Firewatch. So again, this is a game about kind of like loss and what it means to experience loss in a relationship and loneliness. You play a person who like essentially is just monitoring a Firewatch tower and exploring the woods. But it's very melancholy, and you kind of only have this one other person you can talk to on the radio, but you never see them. And it's kind of like a lonely game about talking to somebody who's far away. And again, this is not a game that appears to have a kind of like explicit political agenda, but some people have said this is a game about loss, and this is a game about the inevitability of death, and whatever, however you want to describe it. But it's taken seriously as a piece of art. And Gone Home, I think, is a good example of smuggling in the case of indie games. It kind of presents itself as being almost like a horror story, but then it's like, oh, it's a spooky house and it's dark and it's a stormy night, right? But then you go inside and there's no ghosts, but you slowly realize that it's just the story of like a suburban family that is collapsing. So it essentially presents itself as being a ghost story, but then you realize over the course of the game that really you're in American Beauty. The father's a drunk and he can't finish his novel. The daughter is gay and it's like she's trying to figure out who she is. And this is essentially what the game is about. And then you have stuff like This War of Mine, right? Which is actually a commercial game that made money, but it is very much one of the few examples of the equivalent of a kind of iconoclastic war film in the case of video games, right? This War of Mine is a game just about being a civilian in a war zone and what that means. There's no fighting, there's no victory, there's nothing, right? It's just like survival in a bombed out place. But this is amazingly, this is a commercial game. This game actually made money. So from my perspective, this is to say, this is how I understand, this is how I understand how this middle space can function, is really what I'm trying to say. And again, it's not that there's literally no examples of it in games, but there's not a strong understanding or articulation of this space in games. Especially not at the level of funding. So this is a game that I worked on at MIT. So this is The Snowfield. How many people have heard of this game or know anything about it? Nobody? Few people? Oh, few people. Okay. I had heard that some people might know about it. So. Anyway, so this is a game where you're freezing to death during the First World War, and you freeze every time, and it's about who you're going to freeze with and how you're going to freeze, and is it better to freeze with this way or that way? So it's pretty awful. And but this didn't start like I was saying. This didn't start as an attempt to say something about war or death. It was an attempt, or the insane loss of human life and the madness of it all. It really just started as a storytelling experiment. And really what we did when we were making this is we did a bunch of prototyping that was just about what does it mean to try to create a situation that is dramatic, in which the pieces that we create for the situation will inevitably result in a kind of emotional story. That was really the goal, right? It didn't have anything to do with war. The reason why we chose that setting is mainly just to limit what the player could do. The reason that you're freezing to death is because we didn't want to do that video game thing where you put artificial walls up everywhere. Often the way games constrain the players, they just put invisible walls, and why can't I walk that way? It's a video game, right? It was important to us that actually nothing distracted you from the fact that it was the fact that it was a game. The limitations of it being a game and the limitations of it being a computer program were all narrativized. We're all kind of reinforced. We're all kind of leveraged as dramatic things as part of a story world. Like they weren't, the game was never telling you this is happening because it's a game. The game was saying this is happening because it's the First World War. This game is happening because it's a blizzard, right? So we were very careful for that kind of stuff. So we chose this setting because it answered a lot of those things for us. You had the trenches, which constrain your space for reasons that are diegetic. And they reinforce the idea of you being in this war situation. The reason that it's cold is because we didn't want to have artificial walls. So if you just walk too far away, you just die. And that solved that dissonance problem. So it's believable that you can't just walk away from the main part of the game. Once we had all that stuff, though, we tried to look for examples of what are other ways we can dramatize the fact that we have this World War I situation to make people feel something. And so we were like, now that we have this core, like how do we make it emotional? And that was really the only thing we were thinking about. So we were looking at like what we thought were statements from popular culture about the First World War. We did research as well that wasn't just watching movies and seeing TV shows, but stuff like The End of Blackadder or like again Kubrick's Paths of Glory, right, which are like famous anti-war World War I pieces. So we showed these to the students, and this is kind of what we all had in our heads when we were coming up with these ideas. So this is how we arrived at a game that eventually became something that people were citing and was being nominated for awards as this kind of the word documentary usually wasn't used, but it was essentially that kind of game, right? It was a game that was like about like the horrors of war, and one of the things that we hadn't even considered when we were making it that gained meaning in the context of video games is that there are so many video games about war, but there are almost no games that deal with, I mean, first of all, most games trivialize war, but like there are no games that actually just show you the aftermath of a battle, right? I mean, this war of mine now today does as its main thing, but at the time that this came out, a lot of people said, I've never thought, that this is just like what must be happening after I've run around and killed a bunch of people in a video game. And we hadn't thought about the game being in dialogue with the kind of genre conventions of war video games. We weren't even thinking about war video games at all. We were just thinking about war as a kind of larger topic. But again, that was a happy accident, right? So for me, this is an example of like, it's hard to kind of look at a project like this and think, how would you use this to prove, like with your metrics, that you were like having some kind of impact, right? Like for me, this is an art project, but because you're funding artists who have this kind of interest, you're inevitably going to get something that is political or addressing these kinds of topics, right? Which is typically how, which is typically how the art that exists in this in-between space tends to work. So it's not something that comes with a lesson plan, in other words, right? It's something that is just coming from like the kind of subconscious richness of somebody who's, particular sort of obsessions and questions about culture and society that you're interested in supporting. So yes, and this is, I guess this is what I was going to say. I just said the thing I was going to say on this slide. Anyway, so this is, the main thing I want to stress is that I don't consider this, even though it's not what we intended at all when we started out, I don't consider it an accident. I just consider it the normal process of artistic discovery when you do work like this. So for us, moving forward, after making this game at MIT, like when we're thinking, okay, today, we have the studio, we have these various entities, like we want to make this kind of work, but we want to do it in this kind of commercial middle space, right? Which is to us what really feels missing from the kind of culture of video games, right? Again, both extremes are fine, But the middle space for us is where a lot of the kind of broader cultural conversations about these topics happens in relation to other media. But in games, because stuff tends to be in the nonprofit area, the conversation about it tends to stay in that area, right? So for us, it's like, how do you take this stuff and put it in a kind of more commercial context? So our current project, and this is.
Do you want to just say 2 words about
Sure.
the mechanics of the game, like basically or one?
Oh, what you do? Well, it's funny how I say you just freeze to death. I mean, that's really what happens. Anyway,
But there's a lot of discussion.
yes. So the way the game works, I will explain it. So the way the game works is that you're a soldier. You start out. You're just on the field of battle. Everything is. It's all silent, and you're just walking around in a daze. You can walk left and right and stuff, and you can pick up stuff you find in the ground. But that's it. That's all you can do. And nothing is actually stopping you from doing anything except your own cold. The way that you get warm is you can go to this house that you see in the distance and you can start this fire. So if you pick up stuff that's wood, you can throw it in the fire and that'll keep the fire going longer. And in the world, just wandering around, they have these little simple AIs, are other soldiers that are wounded and they're all just in various states of dying. So one of the things you can do in the game, or not do, you can go and find these other people and all bring them back to the house where you all stay warm. And then you all die together when the fire runs out. So
People have stuff, don't they have letters?
people have letters. So the way you get, some people just follow you. Some people will only follow you if you like find something for them. So like somebody wants a letter that it was from, I don't know, a loved one, right? Somebody wants their not canteen, but their.
It's a great way to give texture and detail to a world that's pretty.
Yeah.
It's pretty barren.
So it's completely barren. Also, we use. Oh, another thing I want to say here too is that we use language, the language barrier as like part of the dramatic limitations, right? So like, the idea was not. But part of the problem of telling a story in video games is conversation, right? It's like, how do you address like the complexities of being able to talk to other people? It's very difficult. Different games have addressed this in different ways. Some people just say, whatever, we're just going to use a convention, which is you can click this to say this, click option A, click option B, which tends to be kind of mechanical. Some people say, well, the option, our option is everybody's dead, and you only hear audio recordings of them because everybody's obsessed with recording themselves for some reason. So, and there's been different approaches to how you address this dissonance of like that talking to people in games is hard. Our solution to this, again, which was another version of the how do you make the answer to any given question not it's a game, was the language barrier, right? So like you're a English soldier and all the other soldiers are German soldiers, and so they're all kind of muttering German and you don't understand them. So the only way to communicate with them is through giving them something or through offering some kind of like, physical gesture in some way. And this is very funny because I actually got in trouble with this with a friend of mine. So a friend of mine who did the voices for all the Germans, he's from Austria. He told me that he read an interview that I did about it, and he said he didn't know it until this interview that the main character is supposed to be English. Like he thought the main character was supposed to be German, and that the reason nobody can talk to anybody is that they're just dying and cold. Like, so he didn't think of the lack of conversation as being because of a language barrier. It was just from the direness of the situation. And I was like, no, but look at his helmet. We did research. This is an English helmet, right? The other helmets are, and he was just like, now I'm angry. So it was funny, but it's also a good example of how sometimes when you create these constraints to try to generate drama through the limitations of games, sometimes you're so effective with one, people won't even notice some of the others, right? Like I thought that I was really adamant about the language thing. I'm like, there's got to be a reason that you can't talk to people. And then everybody else was like, it's so cold in this world. I feel so cold. I move so slowly. The cold feeling of being cold was so overwhelming that was like enough to kind of contextualize the limited interaction for like most of the people who played it. So, it's interesting, right? Like that's how you learn about this stuff.
You're getting cold because the screen starts to freeze.
Yeah, so like you can't quite see it here, but like eventually like the screen begins to be covered with ice and you get slower, and eventually and if you walk near enough to the fire, that all goes away. But if you, for example, if you walk really far away and you're like, oh crap, I'm cold, and then you turn around and start to walk to the fire, you can just screw yourself, right? You can just be like, I can't get there because I'm going to freeze to death, and I get slower and slower and slower. and you're just fighting entropy and losing. So it's so anyway, that's what we did, right, in this game. But this was a game that was, not a kind of for-profit game. This was a game that was a, narrative experiment that was done in a university context. The kind of mechanisms that created the kind of indie film boom of the 90s still exist, and they're kind of adapting themselves to the world of games and interactive, but they're doing it in a way that seems kind of like nervously opposed to being seen as entertainment, right? So they're kind of like, you go to these organizations that are like the organizations that got exposure for stuff like, sexualizing videotape or Pulp Fiction or this kind of stuff, and not that those are the best examples, but creating that whole world, right, that supports that, it's art, it's also entertainment. It brings up issues that we talk about, but we also go to see it. We don't have to go to like an art gallery, right? It just feels like that because games are such a fraught, they have this lingering association with frivolity and sort of pornography that people are kind of like constantly trying to push really hard in the other direction. It's very hard to find that middle ground. But where does that leave us? We have organizations like Indiecade and the Independent Games Festival, which do a better job of highlighting this kind of middle ground. But this is happening totally separate from the kind of larger systems of media. And it's a shame because the larger systems of media are now embracing interactive. Like, the interesting thing about being in the video game space now is that all the stuff we learned 20 years ago, film is learning now. Like, so people are like, we just did a VR thing. Oh my God. Stories can be interactive. Did you know? It's like, yes, we know. So it's and they're like, you have to have a story where you can't control what people look at. It's like, yes, we know. Yes, we did this like 20 years ago. So I mean, I'm being a bit facetious about it, but and a lot of filmmakers are doing great work, even though they are reinventing the wheel. But you don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? There's a real opportunity here for everybody to learn from everybody and bring this whole thing together into like one media kind of culture, as opposed to all these like separate media cultures. And that's something that we could be doing much better at, and we don't see as like happening as well as it could. And my final slide was, we have Scarface. We have this is the other pole, but we don't have this, right? This is the genre work that addresses the serious issue that people watch as entertainment, but also addresses the issue, right? And also creates conversations about the issue. And again, maybe we don't need this. We definitely need that on the other pole, so it's not against that. I want to, again, make that clear. But we really do need this. Like, we need this to be a spectrum, not just two poles where each side is terrified of seeming like the other side. Like, we need to be more comfortable, especially in the space of activism, of embracing ambiguity. What if somebody takes your activism the wrong way? Well, that's what it means when you let an audience make up their mind. If you insist on controlling the audience's mind, you're making propaganda, right? You're not engaging them in a conversation. So that's it. That's my talk. And I guess we got about 10 minutes.
So Snowfield, I've always liked it because for me it's a great example of a narrative experience, but not a narrative structure.
Yep.
Do you see narrativity as being part and parcel of this structuring agency that maybe technology is also? So you've talked to us about the limits of technology in a way, of the kind of rule set notion of what a game is, how that embedded in that already are like norms and values. Does narrative have that as well? The kind of narrative as structure?
Absolutely. And I think that part of the problem, one of the things that I know that like Claire and I subscribe to is like, we wanted to have these T-shirts that we would go to game developers conference with that just said like "fuck plot," because it's like because for us when you say story and narrative, a lot of people think you mean plot. They think you mean like a set of events in time, and that's why people tend to think of like storytelling and more open-ended play possibilities as being somehow naturally opposed. We don't believe this at all. Like, we actually think that not only is it wrong, really all storytellers ever do is systems design and play in a way. So like if you ask really good storytellers like what they do, they'll talk like game designers and systems designers. Like for example, like Stephen King has this famous story where he says, people are like, why did you, I forget the character in the Dead Zone, whatever. They're like, why did you kill this guy at the end of your book? Like, why does what's-his-name die at the end of the Dead Zone? And he's like, I didn't kill them. They had to die because of the way the world had been set up, right? And that's, I mean, that's game design. That's simulation design. That's like saying, you know, when you create logics in your world, they're logics of psychology, of like society, of religion, of all these things. And then if you're a good storyteller, you're allowing these things to act upon each other in order to create drama, in order to follow characters through a series of events. But the events are just evidence of the world building, of all this other work that you've done. And if the story isn't turning out the way you want, you don't just make something happen. That's a deus ex machina, right? You know, you go back and redesign the world so that the natural thing to happen is maybe closer to the thing you want to happen, right? Like a story turning out a bad way is like evidence of bad world building. So like, and storytellers don't just get to do whatever they want. Storytellers have to create coherent worlds in which things make sense and happen for reasons. And this is essentially what game designers do, right? They create a coherent fictional world, and you're codifying it as part of a computer program or as part of like rules on a game board or something. But, and I don't want to be overly formalistic about it. I mean, like it can be mushy and allow for, you know, subjectivity and all this stuff, right? So I know I'm not overly I don't want to be overly, I don't mean this as an embrace of the formalist model, but you know, we see storytelling the way that people in theater and kind of like improvisational, you know, closer to improvisational theater. You know, like what's your motivation? What are your verbs? What are you going to do? How do you set up a situation so certain kinds of things happen? And then you kind of like through the alchemy of like, you know, the kind of like human actor or performer and their imagination and their reactivity, do you kind of like discover things? You discover a story, you create a story happens. For us, that's what you ought to be doing when you create a story in an interactive context. And for us, that's not opposition to, but an extension of sort of like normal storytelling that happens in linear media to an interactive context. In other words, a writer is just running that in their head instead of just putting it in a computer when they are thinking of a linear story. But they're thinking of it as a possibility space, what we call in interactive media a possibility space. It's a set of logics that means certain things can happen. So yeah, drama, conflict, psychology, social forces, but plot is the plot is evidence of those things. It's not the thing itself. It's like plot is evidence of that. Plot is the chalk outline, right? It's not the body. No more questions?
Do you know Alan Wake?
Yes.
Okay. Do you think this is more on the left, on the right, in the middle?
I guess it's like, I haven't played a lot of Alan Wake, but I guess it's kind of more in the middle. Mm-hmm. I mean, which is fine. I mean, that's not a criticism of it, but you know, it presents itself. Really, the selling point for that game was, ooh, it's Stephen King. You know, it's like if you love Stephen King, play Alan Wake. You know, and but yeah, it gets into like deep psychological stuff.
I say that because I wonder what you think about the interactions that has this kind of indie games. Because if I think about Firewatch or your game, for instance, I think that it is not only about the plot or the fictional system, but also about the mechanics and the rules that you design that are in somehow special. Somehow the way that you play those games, like the games that I said, are somehow special. And Alan Wake game, the plot is interesting, the storytelling is interesting, but at the end, the mechanics and the gameplay is somehow we've been engulfed with it in past in other games. You know what I mean?
So this is exactly what the workshop is about. This is exactly what the workshop is about. So like, yeah, I mean, mechanics are ideological, right? So if you say my game is about redemption, but the only thing you do in the actual game is run, jump, and shoot, your game is about run, jump, and shoot. It's not about redemption. So like a lot of times when games claim to address serious topics, they're not actually doing it through the player action, right? They're doing it through the presentation, right? And again, Red Dead Redemption, which is like essentially like a Western by the people who made GTA. So essentially it's GTA with a horse. It's presented like a kind of like a Twilight Western, like Unforgiven or something, right? And it's not. It's a game where it's fun to kill people, right? Because you can't have a game where like you have to kill 47 people, and then in the cutscene he's like, "Oh, I hate killing people so much." You know, it's like, you know, you can't have it both ways. I think that a lot of games now understand this, and they kind of crave the cultural, the kind of social capital of being seen as being serious, but they also don't want to alienate their what they see as their audience that is based on power fantasy, on satisfying power fantasy. So they kind of try to have it both ways. And typically how they have it both ways is they keep the systems the same, but they give it a whole somber tone, you know? And for me, this is basically disingenuous, right? Like
This is the story of Hollywood, right? Let's too much problem with the gangsters, so let's make it a police show where all these murders are justified because it's the police.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's the same.
Yeah, exactly. It's essentially the same thing. The real question in games is how are your verbs enacting the kind of themes and ideas that you are that you want the player to kind of engage with. A really good example of a game that does this well is Papers, Please, right? Which is a game about being an immigration guard, or really an immigration, I don't know, bureaucrat at the border of a kind of like a fictionalized, but essentially like, you know, East-West Berlin style checkpoint. So the idea is that there's this kind of country that everybody wants to leave, and you are there, and they come to you, and you have to look at their passports, and you have to like figure out who has the proper papers, and you have to send them back if they don't. But some of them, you might be sending some of them back to their death, and then you have to decide if you let some people through. If they have improper papers, you can let them through, but then you get in trouble. Like you can't feed your family. There's another game that I really like called Ulica Dimitrova, which is about being a kid. And again, it's another game about being cold, but it's a game where you're a homeless kid in St. Petersburg, and all you can do is cheat. All you can do is rob and steal and give money to your mom, who's a prostitute. And all you can do is walk around in a circle. The game is like you figure out how to give your mom money. And then you play the game for about 10 minutes and you're like, this is all I can do, right? And then the game doesn't really give you any other options, but it uses the limitations of the game as a metaphor for the lack of social mobility of the character, right? So like, I realized, I'm like, how do you finish this game? And eventually I let go of the controller just to kind of like, I think I was like looking at my phone. I'm like, has anybody written how to finish this game? And after letting go of the controller for 30 seconds, the kid lies down and goes to sleep and he dies. And because he freezes to death. Because it snows that night and he dies. And that's the only way to finish the game, right? So that's using verbs, actions in a kind of rhetorical, ideological way. And that is really what the workshop is about, right? Because the whole workshop that's next is essentially about that. Which game? The one about the kid?
Yeah.
It's called Ulica Dimitrova. And I don't know if I can write it down for you.
Okay.
I can, yeah, come and ask me. But yeah, I mean, I have examples of lots of different games that do stuff like this, right? So, but again, this is a game that, you know, was just a game made by one person, right? You know, I would love it if, again, there was more support for this kind of work, right? Because I feel like there is support for it in other media, right? Like, you don't go to a Hollywood studio and say, I want to make Spotlight, and they're like, who would ever watch that movie, right? I'm not saying it was easy to get that funded, but it did get funded, and stuff about serious topics gets funded in Hollywood. It's hard, but it's not like, it's a thing that happens. Whereas in the world of interactive media, things that are in that in-between space, it's much harder. But I think we're poorer for it as a culture. Again, like I was saying, we need the spectrum, not just the poles. But yeah, I actually have a bunch of examples of games that do this, and I'm happy to give out.
But what was the first one that you said like before the
Papers, Please.
Please.
Papers, Please.
Okay.
That one is easy to find. I mean, both of them are
No,
easy.
the other one I find it, the Ulica.
Ulica Dimitrova. Papers, Please is the other one, and Papers, Please is really good. It's a great example of a systems argument, what I would call a system, game making an argument through a system. And that game also made money. So that one's pretty interesting. And also that game had an impact on, had enough of a cultural impact that it was actually turned into a movie. like some filmmaker just made a movie of Papers, Please. And it's basically just like the what is that movie? The Lives of Others. It's like that, but it's based on a game. So I don't know. I mean, it's the art form is healthy, in my opinion, right? It's more just like the art form is. I think the broader culture is having a hard time understanding the breadth and nuance of what it can be.
I mean, I think it's that. I think it's the fact that there are limited funds that have been already claimed by one medium, and they're not about. I mean, there's
Exactly.
vested interest there.
Of course,
It has
of course,
to be a
yeah.
budgetary shift that's
Of course.
going to be slow and coming.
Of course, so I'm not.
That pitch will be about a different kind of audience reach at the end
Yeah.
of the day. That's the tale that will convince them.
So I mean, everybody has to keep working. Everybody has to keep plugging away, trying to get their work seen, right? And hopefully there's something in that middle space that hopefully there'll be a critical mass of stuff in that middle space that hasn't been funded but was like just made by people on their own, that becomes successful enough that hopefully you begin to create that space and people begin to. And also, I really think it's important for arts organizations and organizations that are interested in. Are interested in theory in supporting that kind of art, see that stuff in that middle space as art, even though it is part of popular culture as well. There's such a, and again, I know why, but there's such a strong sort of like desire to distance yourself from anything that could conceivably be considered entertainment, that we lose the whole middle. But yeah, that's it. Is that
That's great. Thanks.
okay? Great.
So I think, yeah, thanks. I thought this was sort of